Hi, I'm Tom Kalopoulos. I'm your instructor for the Innovation Masterclass. The Masterclass was developed by Delphi Group over the course of the last 20 years. We looked at organizations across all industries and how they apply innovation in a sustainable and a systemic way. And that really is the essence of this course, to help you better understand how to apply innovation within your organization's context. Over those last 20 years, I've written over 10 books. One of the books that we'll draw on extensively is the Innovation Zone. And we'll look at how you build an innovation zone within your organization. Now, I have to tell you that a lot of this is going to be very practical, nuts and bolts advice. We'll look at the mechanics of innovation and the process of innovation. So how do you begin such an enormous discussion? Well, let me start by asking you a very simple question. Do you believe that everything great has already been invented? Few of us would subscribe to this notion, right? But what if I were to tell you that we actually behave it? And it's the behaviors of our organizations that define their culture. And most often, it's that culture that inhibits and prevents innovation from flourishing and becoming a process and being sustainable. And that's really what we want to focus on. So, if I were to ask you to summarize in a single word what it is that's creating all this tremendous momentum and this fuel for innovation, what would that word be? And what if that same word was to answer the question, how do we move forward over the course of the next 200 years? How do we deal with the complexity of climate change? How do we deal with the potential of pandemics? How do we deal with very complex supply chains? All these issues are ultimately brought together by a single concept, and that is the concept of connections. And that's part of what I want to focus on as the driver for innovation. The connectivity that we've created and that we will create, and I'll show you some numbers in just a minute, really is the fuel that is motivating innovation and inspiring so many of us to think about innovation in a more scientific and a more rigorous fashion. And here are the numbers. Over the course of the last 60 years, we've seen a tremendous explosion in the amount of connectivity, not just between person to person and person to machine, not even just machine to machine, but today between all objects. When we talk about the Internet of Things and the Internet of Everything, we will look at how this connectivity is creating a tremendously rich environment for innovation. Let's put some numbers on it before we go any further. When you look a bit more closely at this chart, what you'll see is that the line which goes from the lower left to the upper right here is drawn on a log scale. I can't draw it in a linear way because the line would literally go up into the clouds and into the stratosphere. What this line represents is the total number of user computing devices in existence. Now, if you notice, pay close attention, while today we have 10 billion total user computing devices, back in 1960 we only had 1,000. And we've clearly gone through many generations of different types of devices, from mainframes to departmental computers to PCs to laptops and, of course, now mobile devices and tablets and even wearables. The notion of what a computing device is changing in and of itself, and we'll see more about that in just a minute. But I want you to pay attention to the fact that in every decade, what's happened, and it's fascinating, very consistent, we've increased the number of user computing devices by one order of magnitude. And that's been a very consistent trend all the way up to the present day. So as we move forward and these devices change and they become wearable devices, inhalable devices, devices that will be part of our food supply and the medicines that we take, what might that connected world look like? Well, the reality is that if we project forward and take the number of devices that we have today available to us, and by the way, on average, you already interact with about 253 of these computing devices every single day. Many of them are in your car. Others are in the wearable devices for fitness or for health purposes that you have. If you project this out, by 2100, there are 10 to the 20th total computing devices in the world. That's a big number. Give me an analog for that to help me better understand it. There are 10 to the 24th stars in the known universe. That's a big number. It's a little easier to get your arms around. But let me give you one that really drives the point home. This is 100 times as many computing devices as there are grains of sand on all the world's beaches. Now, not all the deserts, we'll leave those out of the equation, but all of the world's beaches. Is that difficult to comprehend? Do you want to look at that number and say, that couldn't possibly be? Well, if I took you back to 1960, you would say the same thing about where we are today. You would say, Tom, 10 billion computing devices, who would use those? How would we manufacture them? How would we be able to afford them? But the reality is they have become affordable. We have found reasons to use them. However, if you go back in time, every generation used a different technology platform to communicate and to collaborate. That's not the case going forward. Now, if we look at the 20th century as an example, every time we try to move into the future, we would do so relatively slowly. And a lot of times we would bounce off of this wall. We didn't go directly from the present to the future. In fact, what we did is we took this rather circuitous route through many generations of different technologies to communicate and to collaborate. It was a long journey. It was an arduous journey. It was like climbing Everest, for goodness sake. And along comes your mother or your grandmother very suddenly and slingshots into the future using a tablet or a smartphone. That slingshotting is what happens when technology finally becomes so affordable, it becomes so usable and so simple that there's no excuse not to use it. That is in large part why innovation is such an important topic today, because it applies to everyone. We are all suddenly in a situation where innovation is going to change not just the quality of our lives, but the very way in which we live, we work, and we play. Innovation is not about just inventing new things. Innovation ultimately is about creating value. And that's where we'll go in the next segment of our conversation. We'll talk about how innovation differs so dramatically in the future from what we used to call invention in the past. More on that in segment 2 of the Innovation Masterclass.